Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, PCI for Travel Agents, Protecting Valuable Customer Data. And I'm Judy Howard in our Customer Experience and Operations area here at ARC. And I'm very excited to have with me this afternoon as our guest presenter is Adnan Jaffer. He was just promoted to Director of Enterprise Risk and Compliance here at ARC. And he's been here for over 6 years, and his prior experience before coming to ARC has always been in the area of corporate internal audit, risk management, and compliance. So for the time in his tenure here, his responsibilities have included enterprise risk, compliance and ethics, ISO 27001, PCI programs, among other responsibilities, which include supporting the internal audit and board and management committees. So Adnan has a lot of responsibility here at ARC, and he is always looking at ways to protect the company, protect our customers, and in the area of that compliance and risk management. So I'm going to turn it over to Adnan now, and he's going to do our presentation. But before we get started, I just want to let you know, just ask all your questions at the panel on the side. If you have anything in the area of, this risk management, compliance, anything that's a burning question or that you may not even know applies, ask it anyway. Some of these we may have to take offline individually, but we're going to try to get to most of these questions that are asked. And as we go through the presentation, I'll kind of interject these to Adnan as we go along. So please, again, ask questions. Now is the time. We have our expert here on the phone. So Adnan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Judy, for that introduction. I always kind of say that if I'm doing my job correctly, that the executives and board can rest easy. So that's like, if someone asks me what I do, that's what I do. That's the goal of my job. And to Judy's point, this is my second time presenting on PCI, and I'm still, so this is somewhat similar to what I did last year for the Fraud Awareness Week. And, I'm starting to make sure that I sharpen this presentation for the travel agents a little better going forward. And, your input, I'm always open to feedback, so you're not going to hurt my feelings. I think it's always a good thing to continuously improve. So, if you want to hear about different things, if you want to see different things, please let me know, and we can definitely, kind of cater to that as well as we go forward. So, but thank you again, everyone, for joining today. Hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend, and let's talk about PCI. So, all right, here we go. So, setting expectation for the webinar. So this is kind of like my disclaimer for everyone here. We're doing this on behalf of ARC, and it constitutes the kind of the industry best practices for PCI. This isn't a how to become PCI compliant, but just provide some guidance on how to manage customer data going forward, right? And so the ARC ARA kind of states here, and I think I have some updated information as well later in the presentation, but I'm not going to read this overall, but we do expect that all agents that deal with credit card information are PCI compliant. We do not validate that per se, but we just want to make sure that the travel agents do abide by the PCI DSS. Okay, so that's out of the way. So for our agenda, I want to go over kind of the importance of being compliant. I'll talk to you about some of the nuts and bolts around the payment card industry. What we do here at ARC for staying PCI compliant, and then managing your customer data going forward. So there's a couple areas that we'll cover as well. And as you have questions, Judy will kind of reach out to me during the presentation, and we'll answer those. And if I have to kind of speed up or slow down to just kind of get through the presentation, that's really okay. I know which slides we can pay attention to and not pay attention to. But all right, so the importance of being compliant. So why we need data security overall. And so I was going through some of the articles, on Wall Street Journal and just kind of other security and industry blogs that are out there. And so, we see just a number of them throughout the years, right? What was interesting was I was kind of doing some research for this presentation today, and knock on our Formica here, and there hasn't been a credit card breach in 2019 yet that we've heard about. So that's really interesting for us, but it seems like we've been hearing about these kind of credit card exposures a lot in the last few years for sure, but This year, it's kind of been quiet. So, but I put one here for 2019 in terms of exposed data, right? So this really speaks to, did you have the proper controls in place, and were you able to make sure that all your data is actually being protected correctly, right? So meaning that you might have not had a breach per se, but you had essentially someone who knew what they were doing potentially could kind of get into your system and take that data if they wanted to. In this case, for that first article, that's kind of what happened, where nothing was really breached per se, but the data was exposed. And so the good thing, there was a good actor that came in and said, hey, I can get to your data. Do you realize that? And they really remediated very quickly. So again, it's all about data security overall, which includes credit card information. And, as you have, passport information, other people's personal identifiable information, that's also important to look at, but we're going to be talking about PCI, obviously, today. So PCI compliance, sound business practices, and some of this is just making sure that we can protect our customers' data while kind of building that into the culture of our company and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so some of the advantages are, just making sure that you have protection against fraud, right? This is something that's important so that the credit card information is put into a place where it cannot be taken by someone who doesn't need it. Even still, sometimes, the people who do have access to it, you have to also, make sure that they're doing it with integrity as well. So that's my other part of my job on the integrity side. Having good practices also helps uphold your brand name, right? So one thing that we pride here at ARC, and part of the introduction was that we are also, in addition to being PCI compliant, we're also ISO 27001 certified. And what that really means is that we really take security in a very good posture, meaning that what's important to us. And so we don't just protect credit card data, we protect all of our data here at ARC. So that's a really good thing. It's a good thing from our brand perspective as well. Facilitating customer confidence, everyone on the phone essentially is a customer of ARC, Hopefully we exude that confidence where we are a trusted provider for you and that we hold, your customers' data in a safe fashion. I noted that clarifies where data assets reside in your network. Going forward, this is going to be a great thing for you to kind of work on as a company overall, for your company, just understanding where your data is, understanding where it is within your environment, because that is increasingly being a more important topic as we look at how data is in the industry landscape overall. Here at ARC, we definitely have this understanding of where data is, but as we have new systems or new transformation, it's even more important for us to really understand where that data is going in and coming out from overall. And obviously the last point, we're required to have it by the payment card brands, right? That's what PCI came from. So this is the slide where it kind of says, what wrong could happen. What could happen if something went out. Now this is like everything under the sun. This wouldn't be if you had breach of one credit card data, all this isn't going to fall upon you or anything like that. But this comes in, it depends on the level and severity of the breach or exposure of credit cards within your environment. So again, it's just a soup to nuts kind of listing. But it's a matter of just being aware of what could happen if something went wrong, right? That's all that is overall. So, so save us from that day that anything like that happens, right? Responsibilities. So here I kind of divided the slide up between like ARC participants and ARC. So I noted that already kind of in the earlier in the deck, but I want to put it back in there because I think it's important for us to kind of reiterate that within the industry agent handbook, that we do say that, any ARC participant that accepts payment cards, credit cards as payment must keep all payment card numbers and personal information secure, right? And you can continue to read on from there, but that's the stewardship of that data for you, right? It's a matter of, we do that on the ARC side and the same thing on the agency side. There's an ecosystem here that goes from agency to GDS to ARC, and then back down to the agents and carriers and back and forth. So it's important for us to have that understanding of the ecosystem. For us, again, from an ARC perspective, we adhere to ongoing compliance at processing ARC. We deal with those day to day. We have to make sure that those are, explicitly done within the controls that we have internally here. And then we have an understanding on, violating the PCI DSS, that data security standard. If we're not patching appropriately, that's not a question for us. There's so many things within the PCI data security standard that, we understand that we must do. It's not an optional thing. It's something that we understand what the implications are for that. And, we understand, and that's part of my job, right? To be able to say that, hey, XYZ IT or security user, you have this responsibility for PCI to do this. So. All right, so that's a good segue into, what is the payment card industry? So a couple terminology items I want to just put out there, because I'm going to be talking about DSS a lot, SAQ, so I want to make sure that we kind of talk about what that is. So PCI Data Security Standard, DSS, it's the baseline of technical and operational requirements designed to protect account data. I will have another slide that talks about what the DSS looks like, and we'll get into some of that. The SAQ, the self-assessment questionnaire, if you have a certain number of credit cards you're going to process, you're going to definitely be filling out an SAQ within your area. And again, it's a self-assessment of your environment, and that's kind of, it's a little bit of an honor system, but that's the way that they do it. But it kind of goes through all of those areas within the DSS and self-evaluating yourself against that. Vulnerability scanning, it just helps secure your business by identifying weakness in your network and applications. Again, a best practice overall for us to be doing, within our companies. In certain areas we're required to do that, but I think it's also it's an important part of looking at this, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. A QSA, a Qualified Security Assessor. These are the individuals who would be more on the professional side for you to actually talk to if you needed someone at that, and we'll talk about level 1, at that experience level to be able to say, where do I need to be at? And they'd be the advisors that have the certification and the skill set to be able to come into your company and advise you appropriately. An approved scanning vendor. This is an individual or company that's certified to perform vulnerability scanning, so it kind of goes hand in hand. We have a approved scanning vendor on our side who does our quarterly scans for us here at ARC. And the cardholder data, so that's CHD, right? Refers to any information printed, processed, transmitted, or stored in any form on a payment card, right? So just a couple of housekeeping items from just a terminology perspective I wanted to go over. I'll go quickly through this, but just a history lesson on kind of how the PCI standard kind of came about. So back before 2006, a number of, each of the payment brands had their own kind of data security standard. And each one had said, if you take Visa, if you take MasterCard, if you take American Express, you have to follow these data security standards to essentially secure our credit card information, right? So fast forward, they kind of came together and said, you know what, we can come together and create the PCI Security Standards Council, right? The PCI SSC, more acronyms for us to remember. But essentially what they've done is consolidated all those standards together and said, here's the one single standard that will actually kind of rule them all, right? To be able to say that if you do this, then that's where you'll be protecting all credit card data in its entirety. And then the enforcement of the merchant compliance is managed by the individual payment brands, not the council. And the same is true for non-compliance penalties. So, thank God we haven't had to deal with this at all, but it's one of those things where when we finalize our PCI compliance attestation of compliance at the end of the year, we have to report to all the payment brands whom we do business with overall to say, here Discover, here MasterCard, here Visa, here American Express, ARC is PCI compliant, and therefore, you want to know about this stuff. So God forbid on the other side, if something does happen, to ARC from a breach perspective, each one of those payment brands would come back to us and say, hey, what's going on? And then who knows what else, kind of questions they would ask going forward. So.
Another question has come in.
Yep.
Are most of the vendors that an agent would deal with in the industry, hoteliers, cruise lines, tour operators, airlines, obviously, are they mostly PCI compliant? Do you know, is that something that,
yes,
we benchmark ourselves with in the industry?
Yeah, and I'm not sure about like benchmarking, but I know that a lot of them, so we're a very different model as well, right?
Yeah.
So we're both a merchant and a service provider.
Okay.
And like the cruise lines, the hotels are typically merchants with what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're accepting credit cards and they're typically processing them overall. So the settlement piece, they probably could be selling. I'm not sure, again, the back end for their settlement, whether
Mm-hmm.
they do, they might have a third-party processor. Does that work? But yes, I mean, if they're handling any 15, 16-digit credit card numbers, for sure they're going to need to be PCI compliant.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's a good question. That's something that we can take off and I can do some research on.
Yeah.
And that's
because it's good to know that, ARC is
Yep.
PCI, but what about all the other entities that, the travel agents and the
absolutely.
deal within the community,
So,
booking their customers' travel,
yeah.
and how protected is that data?
Absolutely. And so, this is a little history for me. So I used to work at Carnival Corporation, and so part of that was that we had to be PCI compliant for the merchant information that we took overall. So I know that for a fact over there, but
Yeah.
it's a different scale. But yes, that's they have to be doing those things. So, yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
And thanks for doing a little research too that maybe you can
absolutely. It was great.
communicate back out. Here's another question that came. How do we get certificates that Sabre is PCI compliant, then ARC is PCI compliant? That is where our credit card data is stored.
Sure.
Is there something on our website that shows that, or
Typically,
maybe something
yeah.
on,
and this might be a good action item for me going forward.
on like Sabre's website?
Yeah. So there's also the way that so from a third party, so I'm going to get into a little technical here, but we do have a third-party risk management program here, and we have to also look at entities that have PCI compliance overall. And so the Visa merchant listing site is a decent site to go to see. It may not be 100% comprehensive, but it's got at least really high confidence that everyone's listed there. So you can go to Sabre, you can type in Sabre. You'll see that they are PCI compliant at a certain time frame, because anyone who needs to be PCI compliant, like I said before, has to submit that to the payment card brands, and Visa is one of those payment card brands, and they kind of they do a good job of updating their service provider listing overall. And I think they use that more as a marketing tool, but that's fair, But at the same time, that's one thing. To get our PCI attestation of compliance, that would be essentially contacting me and be able to say, here's the reason why. Because I understand that, because we are part of your ecosystem and we extend your scope for PCI. So absolutely, we do part of that responsibility for you from a settlement and clearing. And that, that is absolutely a question I get multiple times a year. Can we please have your PCI attestation of compliance? For sure. For Sabre, I'm not sure. It might be another individual who does similar things on, for what I do. Typically, it might be in their security department, and they might have a risk and compliance manager or director there. Again, I haven't reached. So we are downstream from Sabre, so we don't really ask for that because they're not part of our ecosystem, and so.
And that's probably something I've done for the person that asked us on the call here today is probably go to Sabre's website and Google. They may even have something about PCI compliance on their website because it is such a big topic these days and an important one.
Sure.
Or see, I'm sure there's a contact number and actually call in that or email them.
Absolutely.
And they would probably guide you to the correct person. Right, Adnan?
Yeah, and the typical way that I get notified is, someone calls into our customer care center and they're like, "Hey, Adnan, is this something for you?" And I'm like, "Yep, that's for me," and I'll, make sure I take that contact and I, follow up on that conversation. And so with Sabre, actually, I'm sure they have an assurance program that's out there,
right.
Whether it be on their website or, through their customer contact. Again,
Yeah. Because the concern here is obviously a lot of agents do use client base that is with Sabre, and the concern is if they're storing all their client information there, is is Sabre PCI?
Yeah, and
it's really an important question.
And it's even a fair question to ask. What other potential security frameworks are you certified against too? And there's I'll offer one more thing. Even if they have like what we call a SOC 2 or SOC 1 SOC. -1 or SOC-2, that provides a good understanding on how their IT controls are also in place as well. So But I think we're digressing from that. So, okay.
I'm just reading I think it's more of a statement that just someone had typed in.
Okay.
And it says Sabre instituted to connect with any Sabre system or access PCI compliance system. The use of TLS12 encryption will be required to conduct business. Upgrading to TLS 1.2 provides the highest level of protection against known vulnerabilities.
I know the talking.
I think that's per the Sabre website. So, Adnan, can you?
So what the customer here was saying here was that around there's a new protocol that PCI had mandated, well, goodness, last year, TLS, which is Transport Layer Security. And I don't want to get too technical, but think of this as the pipes between you and us and them going forward over the internet. And so what happens is that everyone had to update their systems to be able to make sure that all of their applications, their servers, their switches, all their networking gear had to be at the specific protocol level of TLS 1.2 because the ones before them have become weak and they could be they're vulnerable, I'll put it that way. And so once we got into 1.2, that became the standard now. And so from an agent perspective, all you have to worry about how you're looking at it is that as long as your browser, your Internet Explorer, your Chrome, your Firefox, whatever, is the most up-to-date browser, then you are good to go overall because that's embedded inherently into those browser capabilities. Now, if you're doing some sort of direct connection with, a GDS or ARC or whatever, that might be a little different because then you might have to do some testing with us to be able to say that, are we on the proper TLS protocol and making sure that we're supported from that perspective. So, but I think from our perspective, we finished this up last year and we make sure that we looked at all of our agents and airlines and said, making sure that they were on the proper browser version. And we had some stats that we were running, it was, I think at some point we had like 12,000 connections coming into us at one point. And when we were getting ready to roll this out last June, we were down to next to 40 people. And we're like, you know what, that's a significantly low enough number that we were, immaterial to us to be able to, they'll get it, we'll figure it out, and then, we'll go forward. So I think that was one of those things where we took, a risk-based approach around it, and we said, hey, we're good to go. I don't think we're going to have disruption. And if there was for anybody, it was a quick fix overall. So, but that's what that question was kind of.
Okay, no, that's great. Good information, and thanks for folks on the webinar here today. And someone also had sent in a link in regards to the Sabre question, and I sent that out to the prior person that asked. So thanks for all your help here this afternoon. Here's another question, and then Adlan, I'll let you get going back on your presentation. And you may or may not know this, but is there a different certificate needed for an agency in the U.S. versus the UK?
From my experience, there is not. The standard is a standard, right? So there's not a different standard for PCI, right? There might be different governing laws that, they have different regulatory or legal requirements from their perspective, but from the PCI Council, that's an international organization, and they have meetings all over the world, and it's the same way. So yeah. Okay.
Awesome. No, thanks.
Sure.
I'll let you get back to it.
No problem. So the final point on this slide is actually a critical point I wanted to make sure I talk about, because this talks to really about, does PCI apply to me, yes or no? And so PCI applies to all merchants, systems, networks, and applications, and this is the key part, that process, store, and or transmit credit card numbers. And that means the full 16-digit credit card number overall, right? So even if you are doing a masked number or you're doing like the last four, that doesn't actually constitute a credit card number, okay? And so that means that if you're accepting, if you're storing, or you're transmitting a full 16-digit credit card number, PCI applies to you. So I want to make sure that's crystal clear. And I'll continue to talk about that as we kind of go through this presentation. I do have a couple stories on that. So, all right. So PCI DSS, 12 requirements for compliance. What you don't see is 251 sub-requirements across these 12 domains to fully address the growing, threats, and there's some strong wording there to customer payment information. So, so this is overall the 12 domains, or essentially 12 requirements on the right-hand side that an individual would need to be for PCI compliant. Now, what does that mean to like an agency? Now, you may not need to actually be compliant with all 12. It's whatever applies to you and the company overall. So when you look at some of these areas, there may be areas that those, it's like, do you really need a vulnerability management program? Do you really need, something where you're looking at patching of systems potentially? I don't know. It might be something that might not be applicable, but again, a QSA or someone who does this work for you might be able to answer that appropriately, because again, it's something where each company is very different than one another in how they actually interact with this information. So whether it be all 12 of these areas, or you might be picking and choosing, it depends. And so that's kind of what the process is overall. But again, at a high level, this is kind of what the DSS looks like overall, and this is kind of how we're looking at it. Oops, didn't mean to go there. So the PCI level, which one are you? And this is going back to how many transactions do you actually process on an annual basis. And there's two types of them. There's a merchant side and there's a service provider side. And as I mentioned before, ARC is both the merchant side with our TAF product, and on the settlement side, we are kind of that, service provider for the industry as well. So from an agency perspective, it depends on what level you're at, right? So there's 4 levels here, and level 3, 4, 2, or 1, depending on what you're looking at. But it's all about transactions, right? So if you're doing less than 20,000 a year, you're level 4, and then if you're doing excess of 6 million over a year, that's also different. And you're probably in a different ballgame at that point if you're level 1. Yeah, and then it's combined, right? So whether you're doing, 1 or 3 different credit card cards, it's all about the number of aggregate credit cards you're processing on an annual basis. And here's responsibilities. This is important in terms of if you're a level 4, level 3, level 2, the requirements are a little different. And the other thing, I'll make sure I understand. Let me if I have no, I don't have it here. So level 2, 3, and 4, those are where the SAQs come into play, right? And this is about a self-assessment within the PCI DSS. And you might have to go find out which SAQ applies to you. And I believe it goes like A, B, C, and D or something like that. So it depends on what you're doing from your company's perspective. Additionally, I have it in asterisk where it says quarterly scans for network vulnerability by an ASV. And we talked about ASV as approved scanning vendor. The only reason that you would need to do a quarterly scan would be if you have an internet-facing presence and you are accepting credit cards via that internet-facing presence. So if your, travelco.com has got an internet-facing site and you're actually taking credit card information from there, then you would need an ASV. Now, I just was on a travel agent. I'm working with travel agents for a trip I'm going on at the end of June here, and what I noticed was that they've got their own .com site, but then when I was entering in my payment card information into their site, I noticed that it was for a third party that was essentially they were white labeling it to a third party, and in that instance, that responsibility goes to that third party white labeling overall. I think part of it is that making sure that connection is secure once you get there, and I think that third party handles it. So, when I talk about that ASV scanning, that's where the ASV scanning would come into play, is for that payment card acceptor at that point. So, I mean, if you wanted to go and do a vulnerability test on your site, that's great, but it's not required if you're not actually accepting that credit card information and processing it overall. So, all right, continuing on. Okay, we're at the bottom of the hour. We're doing good, so we're fine. So the payment card industry requires the cooperation of these 4 parties, right? So this is kind of the ecosystem on the PCI perspective. So the Security Standards Council created the PCI DSS, and it revises as needed. So I know that there's been some communications about, I think we're on PCI DSS 3.2.1 right now, and they're looking at 4.0 coming sometime, I'm not sure, in the next iteration what they're going to be releasing. So I don't have the details on it just yet, but I know they've been kind of communicating it overall. Credit card companies enforcing the PCI DSS, right? The council is the standard creator, and then these are the people who are coming in and actually making sure that you're doing it. And then merchant service providers, who kind of store and process and transmit that information are responsible for ensuring compliance with the PCI DSS, right? So if you're taking a 15 or 16-digit credit card number, you need to be PCI compliant. And those who handle PANs are responsible for knowing and applying PCI DSS to those transactions, right? So this is as you are, on the phone with someone who's accepting, and you're taking their credit card information over the phone. And I'll kind of go into a story here where someone had given me a call about, that they were being told that they had to be PCI compliant. And as I was, I said, again, I'm totally doing this as a colleague in the industry for you, but got my disclaimer, comment there. But I wanted to know a little more about, what kind of credit card numbers they were actually accepting. And they described the process where, when they started to, take information from a customer, they were entering it directly into the GDS, and they were not writing it down or storing it onto any of their systems at their company. And I said, well, that's actually good news, because if you're entering it directly, over the phone into the GDS has a responsibility for maintaining and securing that information. If you told me that you were writing on a piece of paper or you were putting it into a profile in a database in your company, that has different implications, because that means that that piece of paper needs to be stored securely in a bin somewhere. We'll talk about some of the handling requirements, but that's where some of that PCI, understanding where that data is, right, and how you're using it, that's really important. So understanding that, it was kind of, I told them, I said, it doesn't sound like you're, and the other piece of information they said was that when they get the back office files from, again, I'm not sure if it was the GDS or someone else, that information was even masked within their back office system. So I'm like, even better. So they never had a full 15 or 16-digit credit card number in their system. So I was like, from what it sounds like, you can fill out you don't have to, if you can prove that you do not have any credit card data in, you don't have to worry about being PCI compliant from that perspective. But the handling requirements are very important. That's the key piece of it. So we do this where this is what we call, we scope ourselves out of PCI, and that's a good thing, because from our perspective, not having any credit card information is a good thing. So, and then for my next slide here, PCI is not just for IT, right? It's making sure that kind of my point overall is that yes, IT and security need to be able to understand, how to do the protection and the implementation on their side. But it's one of those things where, the staff members also need to be aware of what's kind of going on within the environment, from, who's involved with the processing and the transactions, and some of the requirements overall. Even at ARC, we do have to make sure that we educate our users around what their understanding for PCI is, because different parts of the business get information. Our fraud department gets credit cards, our customer care center may not get credit cards per se, but they might interact with an agent who might be sharing information inadvertently. So everyone has to make sure that they're part of that ecosystem and they understand what the PCI DSS really means. All right, so just a little bit about ARC, about staying compliant here at ARC. So it's obviously an ongoing process for us. So that's a misnomer to say that it's a kind of a point in time. Now, the way that I look at it is that it's definitely not a point in time. Even though we get assessed on an annual basis, they're still looking at making sure they look back at the previous 12 months overall. And the way that I set up the program, hopefully in its execution, is that it's more of a continuous assurance program. A little bit of an internal audit speak there for you. But a continuous assurance program is really mean that let's look at these things as they happen daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever that, and more internal audit speak here for whatever that frequency of that control is. So mean that if you have something that's a weekly control, then let's look at it overall and let's making sure that, I'm not looking at it weekly, but making sure that maybe on a quarterly basis, we look at that weekly control and say, yeah, we're doing it okay. And we store that and give ourselves credit So when the QSA comes in to look at our assessment, that we are actually already ahead of the game, and then that assessment goes by a lot smoother for us overall, right? So that assessment is that, overall process of making sure that, we're doing what we're saying we're doing from a PCI perspective. The remediation piece goes along with that, right? So if we're looking at those controls on a quarterly basis and we find some issues, we want to make sure we fix those. So we're honest around that. We're making sure that we're fixing them quite quickly and or whatever we can handle at that point.
And I'm just going to interrupt. We have a few questions.
Sure.
And we may need more information on this one that was just asked. It stated that you said we don't need to do a scan if we don't take payment on our website.
Yeah. But
see below what they say. Not sure who they are, so maybe if someone can clarify. From Control Scan.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Control Scan. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe there's something missing from that statement. So
yeah, if again a little bit more information. The question is good. Merchant solutions.
Yeah, and so again, I'm not sure from my understanding, from my research that I've done, and talking to our QSA, that's my understanding on the ASV scan, right? So I'm not sure if people are trying to sell somebody else. And that's the other thing. I don't know if they're just trying to sell you, say, oh, you got to do this. But my understanding is that, again, if it's my company, and I'm looking at this, I'm saying that if I've got budget to do this stuff to make sure that we don't have any vulnerabilities or exposure sites, absolutely, I'm budgeting that in to do a scanning on my overall site, my systems and all overall, because that's just going to be good practice, right?
Right.
I'm just saying that from a perspective of if you are not having anything exposed out to the internet that is sharing credit card information, then it's not a requirement for you to do an ASV, right?
Oh, okay. Got that.
That's what I'm trying to say, right? You might have an internet-facing presence, but you might not be exposing any credit card. You might not be accepting credit cards or showing credit cards or whatever. So therefore, you're not doing it from that perspective.
Okay. And if there's and if you need follow-up more on that, hang on. I think maybe you just asked another question.
Sure.
They said because we have hang on there. Oh, website. They said because we have a website.
Yeah.
So, but if they're not storing credit card information,
again, it's all about how the credit card passes through your site.
Okay.
Right. And that's kind of my example back to the travel agency I was working with, right? So say that they had a presence, right? So they had their overall presence on, their travelco.com site, but then, I'm paying attention because I'm who I am. I pay attention to when I was entering my credit card information, it went to a different site that they were partnered with. It looked like the same site, but it was a different site, overall to say that, and so therefore, and again, you could make the case to say that, yes, this is not, travelco.com, this is, paymentprocessor.com now, and so that's fair, that's a fair game. So I think even at ARC we do some of that where we have, I think we have something similar to that where it's not part of our ecosystem.
Okay. And if, again, you would still like more information on that, you can email me and I can pass that along to Adnan just for more clarity. If you, again, still have more specific.
Yeah, and that's, and that's a very good point. If you want to even show me kind of where on your site that you would, enter credit card information or whatever. Because to me, that's where the crux is if I'm entering in credit card information at the travel.com, interface, and that you're doing that work, then you should be PCI compliant for that.
Okay, and I'm just kind of reading a few more here, Adnan, to capture some of these. And truly, anyone on the phone, if we're not getting to the crux of what your real question is, you can always email me, and I'll pass this along to Adnan. The question is, confused. What if I input my credit card numbers into the GDS STAR program, which is the customer profile that we store in our Sabre GDS? Then that would be on Sabre, correct, to be PCI compliant. It is not on the shoulder of the agents at that point. Is that true?
Yeah, so the way you're setting up a profile that is yours. It's the data that you're putting into Sabre is part of your company profile information. So but they are the stewards of that data when it comes down to that, right? Even though it's your, so if I'm Adnan's travel company, I'm putting Judy Howard's information in the Sabre. Yes, Judy is my client. However, Sabre is storing that data on my behalf, and therefore it's their responsibility to secure that data appropriately. So whenever I book another airline ticket or whatever I'm doing, and Sabre's got that profile information of Judy's credit card number already there, that's on them to secure overall. And that's why when another agent had asked earlier about how do I get Sabre's attestation of compliance, absolutely you want it, because you want to make sure that Judy's credit card information is appropriately secured.
When you're using these third parties.
Exactly.
Or another vendor other than yourself.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. Another one, and then I'll let you get back back going. It said earlier one of the slides indicated that transmission of credit cards over the internet needs to be encrypted or tokenized. What do you mean by tokenized?
Tokenized, one of my favorites.
That's a good question.
Yeah. so good reading, first of all. So the best way I can describe tokenization is this. So if I'm a token, okay, so tokenization, okay, I'm trying to think it a bit better yet. So tokenization is the process where if you give me your credit card number, I give you a picture of a cat, which means I've completely devalued your data overall. And so that's essentially a token, right? So meaning that when I give you back the data, I'm giving you a picture of a cat, and that's going to be traversing in your system, and therefore it's no longer a credit card number in your system at all. Okay, and so it's a simple way that I can describe it. So it's just saying that, you give me a full 16-digit credit card number. It's tokenized, meaning that we're going to know where that, like a third party or another software application will do this for you, but they're going to give you back something that doesn't even matter. I mean, like a picture of a cat, a completely jarbled number, or just even like text that just doesn't mean anything to you. So therefore, tokenization is that process of making sure that even better than encryption to some level is that you can't actually reverse that at all.
You can't do anything.
You can't do anything with that overall.
Because it doesn't even, even if you unscrambled numbers or whatever, it would never.
So exactly. So whenever let's say a bad actor gets in your system, all they're going to see is different pictures of cats. And so that's the way that, and so that's a funny way to look at it, but that's the way I would look at it. So, but tokenization is cool because immediately it can scope you out of PCI from that one perspective, right? It doesn't scope you out from it depends, again, everyone is going to be different, right? So even if ARC is doing tokenization, it's scoping us out of requirement 3 overall, but we still have to abide by different PCI requirements in general. But it just reduces your PCI scope to be easier. So tokenization, that's tokenization. That's an easy way to look at it.
No, that's great, Adnan. Thank you, and thanks for asking that question. For everyone else on the phone might have had was curious about that too.
Yeah,
so
because
thank you.
Because encryption is more or less a mathematical algorithm, right? And you can always break a mathematical algorithm.
Right.
But tokenization, everyone loves cats, right? So,
it's something totally different.
Something totally different.
Yes. Okay, great.
Yeah, because there's more technical detail, but so we're at, let's say, almost 15 minutes left. So let me get through ARC stuff, and so it's super exciting, right? But this slide just tells that all the stuff that I do to make sure that we're PCI compliant, and I'll skip through that. So let's go talk about managing customer data overall. Let's get to that. And so I put this in here for us to understand the kind of the components of a credit card. Everyone really understands this overall, but I'm going to looking at the pictures on the bottom of the slide here. Integrated circuit chip, that now it's the chip and pin stuff that we're looking at. But the PAN is that primary account number. That's pretty much what you can have. Let me see if I have the next slide here. Nope, I don't. So the credit card number, the PAN number, is what you can store overall within that. You're allowed to store the expiration date and the cardholder name and address overall. What you can't store is pretty much, oops, hit the button here. The 4 digits on the front of the card for American Express and the 3 digits back. So the CVV or the CID or whatever, you can never store those within any database or system. That just needs to be passed through, and that's pretty much, we're not storing that information overall. The magnetic stripe information, like if you have an actual, point of sale device that actually scans that magnetic stripe information. So those are the items that you cannot store. So the items on the right you can't store, the items on the left in the red you can store. So it's just really important that you just make sure that if you ever see that in your database or you're putting that into a field or something like that, we shouldn't be actually doing that overall, right? So I know that we were looking at some data here at ARC where, we were seeing some CVV information and we're like, oh goodness, we can't have that information in there. So, we wound up making sure that we talked back to the travel agents and said, let's make sure that, going forward, we don't have that information within our systems overall. So it's just something where if you need that, you have to make sure that you contact your customer back and get that information for whatever reason that you needed that information. So what do I need to do? The first thing is, if you don't need it, don't store it. That's the easiest thing I can say. And that's what we'd like to strive for, is that making sure that you really think about the business justification for why you really need to actually have a credit card number in your environment, right? Making sure that you can not have that is probably the best time and effort you can spend to say that and really justify why you don't need it versus why you do need it, So, and we're trying to get better at that here at ARC too, just to be able to say, what do you need that credit card information for, right? And so, they have to really try to justify that, and we're trying to get better at that as well. The second bullet point is protect. If you do need it, just protect the credit card holder data. Protect the credit card holder data. Protect the credit card holder data. Right. And so that's overall what we're looking at. Preventing unauthorized use, whether data is printed or stored locally, transmitted over a public network, or to a remote server or service provider. Right. So in our day-to-day interactions with different companies, within ARC, within GDS, and whatever, when you're working with some of the more established companies like ARC and the GDSs, absolutely, we're going to have that relationship with you where we have that good stewardship around the connections and how we're looking at the information. But just keeping that in mind, right? Making sure that in any new ventures or partnership that you're going to go, just do the due diligence to say that how are you transmitting that information? How are you storing your information? So on and so forth. Be aware when sending email with credit card holder data, right? Using secure email, and I know that ARC provides some level of secure email overall, but just you can't. Sometimes I look back at like a Google Mail, Gmail, or whatever it is. They are secure. It's one of those things where you can never trust everything all the time. We kind of say fingers crossed overall, but at the same time, if you have the opportunity to use a secure mail application, absolutely do that if you're sending credit card information through. Now, funny thing is that we do that just because sometimes we think, it's just credit card information, we don't care about it, but, it is what it is. So.
Adnan, can you address, because even here at ARC,
yep.
Our faxes don't go to a regular fax machine anymore, but they come to our computers, and that's like with most companies now.
Yeah.
And you always thought fax was so secure because it went through the fax machine,
mm-hmm.
But now with them sitting in people's computers, is it still safe?
Yeah. So I think
how is that different from secure email?
Yeah.
And regular email?
So the fax, exactly. Fax, I love the fax, right? But so now the way that, and I'll use the word pipes, right? Now that our pipes are all kind of on this TLS12 encryption, or not encryption, right? The TLS protocol, excuse me, that gives us a better understanding on that transmission protocol to go forward, right? So even when you're putting it through, like, typical fax machine on your desk, as it comes through us, right? It's going through the phone lines, that's where I can probably say that, we can probably trust those methods of communication.
Yep.
And as they come back on your desktop, right?
Yeah.
That's the question about, again, I can speak about on ARC's behalf, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, we know that we have encrypted hard drives. We know that our connections are secure with the TLS1F2 protocol. We know that the servers that are coming, that are hosting our fax programs are also TLS1.2 and encrypted and so on and so forth. So therefore, it's that comfort that I'm getting, that to say that when you're sending it via fax, you're okay from that perspective.
Okay.
So
okay, even though it's coming to somebody's computer.
Desktop. Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay.
I mean,
And then would that be the case with most faxes these days?
You would think so. I mean, it just depends. Everyone's going to be, again, I can't opine on all the different how people have set up, because we've got even next generation like antivirus on our computers as well. So it's like the way that we've set up our our computers, our servers, our network. It's set up in such a fashion that they are, once it comes on your desktop, it's pretty secure, overall.
Okay.
Now, as we move toward, the next level of, transformation, it might be a little different. So, yeah, but right now, it's all about the handling and being aware. I think, now if you want to send it back out, that's the question about how you send it back out now, right?
Okay.
But now it's like,
when you're usually pushing it to wherever it's going, and those folks are using their desktop to receive their fax, they should be encrypted in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So it still should feel pretty confident.
I think so.
Okay. Because I'm sure people on the webinar today are using faxes and
absolutely, yeah. And so I think it's also
because it always feels a little bit more secure than shooting it off an unsecured email.
No, agreed. And so I think part of it also is we'll talk about handling in a second. So as we get to that, which is a good thing.
Cool. We have about 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
So if anyone has some questions, please send them along.
Yeah, I do make a point here on my, try not to store cardholder data on a laptop. So I think that's the point. The point I'm saying is that not that you can't do that. The point being is that when the useful life of that is come to its end, go ahead and just remove it. I think that's the key there. Is just be a good steward about kind of getting rid of as much data as you can, because you don't need it, overall. Because you can always get it again if you need to overall. So understand which employees have access to systems. So these are some things that are important. So we had a call the other day in terms of with one of our board members. He was asking about who's got access to certain things. So he's really asking about who needs access and who has access, right? This is a really good important thing to understand, even at your company level, to be able to say, you know what, and at the risk of saying to somebody, well, you don't really need access, and they get offended, but you have to put it into the context of, we want to make sure we have a good posture from a security perspective to say that we are only giving people access to systems. It is called least privilege, to say that you only need access to what you really need access to. So it's really important to understand that concept. And then the last bullet point here, in general, no cardholder data should ever be stored unless it's necessary to meet the needs of business, right? With appropriate business justification, of course. So some of my earlier comments and I wrap it up to my final comment on this slide, is that really challenge yourself to really say, why do I need this information, this credit card information overall? And I would even challenge that to like passports and other things that you would want to question about overall, because the less the valuable data you have, the better, right? You want to have a boring environment. I'll put it that way, right? The boring, the better. So, what do you need to do with cardholder data? So this is kind of the handling requirements. So if it comes into print form, whether you write it down on a piece of paper, a journal, something on Microsoft Word or Excel, what do you need to do with that, right? Make sure it's masked, right? So a first 6 and last 4, that's totally cool, right? You're devaluing that data, that credit card information overall, right? That's hopefully you have enough information to do your work with that, right? We talked about taking credit card numbers over the phone. If you've written it down, go ahead and shred it once you're done. Make sure that it's unreadable, or tear it up and put it into like 15 different garbage cans or something. If you need PAN data, physically secure the printed copies in a lock cabinet or drawer, right? That's one of the things where lock and key is one of those things where you want to make sure you have it over there. Don't display it in plain sight. Sometimes you have a website that kind of shows it, but if you can not show it in plain sight, let's do that. And obviously, don't distribute the information to those who don't need it, right? So again, going back to that least privilege concept, go ahead and just do what you got to do with it, and get rid of it. Processing it, right? If you're processing cardholder data, all connected systems are applicable. Need to ensure tokenization. We talked about tokenization a bit. Encryption, anti-malware, vulnerability management, user access controls. All those things are in place, right? So ARC is a processor, right? So we've got to do all these things overall under the hood. So hopefully you're not doing the processing piece of it, but if you have to, congratulations, you got to do a little more from a PCI perspective. Transmitting. This is transmitting and storing is an important part of it. So, I kind of use this Starbucks cup here on the right-hand side. And the reason I chose that one specifically was because you can't see the contents of that, whether you're sipping on the straw or you're actually looking into that straw. So, you don't know if it's coffee, if it's orange juice, if it's water, right? So when you're transmitting data, this is the way that you want to look at it overall. You don't want to have, from the observer outside looking in, you can't actually see inside of it. You're just seeing from the outside that, okay, it's being sent through the transmission method, right? So encrypting your data, tokenizing your data, that's a great thing at all times for that credit card information is wonderful. Limiting access information to encrypted channels, right? So making sure that silver straw over there is pretty much, I'm really saying that that's an encrypted channel there because you can't see what's being transmitted, overall. And then when distributing outside of agencies, always use secure distribution method. We talked about that. Secure FTP is something that is, if you need to send like a lot of data to to another individual or to a different department or whatever, that's a good way to do that. Secure FTP, it's a really good way to look at it. Secure mail. And then encrypted media kind of is a older type of thing, what we do now, because why would you put something on a CD or a USB drive? Just go ahead and, there's other ways to do that better. Even ARC's getting away from that overall. So, in storing, same thing. We talked about this stuff, just making sure it's tokenized or encrypted, and then making sure that only the right people need to see it, and then making sure that it's limited access, to those areas where you're going to be looking at it.
Question here.
Go for it. Yeah.
It says our clients want to call up and say charge to our credit cards on file. TRAM's client base say that their programs are just one of our overall PCI security programs. Didn't know about not storing the CCVs, the CIDs, those secure numbers on the cards, as lots of cruise lines and other suppliers request them. So credit cards and profiles are stored, like in these, client-based TRAMs, these data back office systems.
Sure.
But what about the security numbers that are required a lot of times when, agents are booking on behalf of their client, they have their profile set up, they'll need that information potentially to give to the supplier.
Yeah, it's tricky.
What do you think?
It's a tricky thing there, right? And so that's why, I'll go back to kind of the retail side of the house where when you're ordering a pair of jeans online and they've got your credit card information stored, every single time they'll ask for that CVV number every single time, right? And unfortunately, that's the guidance, right? To get it every single time. And so I get it. That's kind of
it's hard when you're booking on behalf of your customer and they may not be available.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so this is where sometimes you have that kind of area where there are sites that don't require it sometimes, and that's where they get away. Not get it. They say to get away from storing those CVV, CID information, and say that just give me your credit card expiration date, and that's it. So I think that's pretty good. But unfortunately, the answer is you got to go back, I guess, and just get that information. But that's kind of the right answer, and I'm using air quotes here to be able to say that. That's the way that you should be doing it overall, because if you're following the guidelines, then that's what we're doing. That's what the guidelines are telling you to do.
Okay, thanks, Adnan.
Yeah.
We have about 2 minutes to wrap up here.
We're pretty much done. I think I put some resources on here from everyone to look at overall from the PCI site, and then in conclusion, for my thing is just know where your data is. I think. Regardless of PCI, it's just so important for you to understand what data you're storing, where it is within your systems, what servers, it's just important for you to understand that. If you don't need a credit card, just get rid of it. That's just good guidance overall. But if you do need it, protect your cardholder data. It's just really important for you to protect that, data. And then bottom line, any entity handling credit cards is required to adhere to the PCI standards, right? So any 15 or 16-digit credit card number that is in your system, you have to protect it, right? And I say that, and I continue to say 15 or 16 is because if it's the first six or last four, you don't need to worry about it.
Okay, so, awesome. Adnan, I truly want to say thank you for everyone that joined us today on the webinar. A couple of just informational things. If you do have questions after you leave this call, you can send them to me, jhoward@arccorp.com, and I'll be happy to fan those out to Adnan, and he can respond directly or through me. But again, think about it. If you do have questions still, please let us know. And a couple of other things, we do have a webinar coming up on June 5th about NDC, an update, kind of a spotlight on that, like where ARC is with all of that as we stand today. We also have a TAF webinar coming up, or service fee program and credit card processing program. That comes up on June 26th. And as always, you can go to our website, under training, go to arccorp.com, go to training, and on the right-hand side, it'll say webinars on demand. Click there, and it has all of our recorded sessions for probably the last 6 months or so. And this one will be available there next week. Again, thank you all very, very much for taking the time to join us. Adnan wants to say a few words before we close.
Yeah, just thank you again for your questions. They're really good questions. I think it's something where, as Judy said, as you have different questions, it's really good even for me to understand, where your challenges are to some level, so that I can actually think about them and give you some good answers back. Because, like I always say, if you're thinking about it, somebody else is absolutely thinking about it as well. So, have a great rest of the week, and thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Great, everyone, and hope to see you on future webinars.